I'm really pleased to be here, and I hope that that you get some value from what we're doing here this evening. The fact you're here at all is positive because these issues that I'm going to speak about are issues that we need to talk about. We don't have to all agree on them. We don't have to. I'm not asking anybody necessarily to agree with everything I say. That's fine. It's not a problem for me. But we need to talk about issues. If we don't share these things back and forth, we're not going to make any progress at all. And so that's kind of my logo there. It's the concept of little boys rising. And I mentioned that this is a bad time to be a little boy or a male, a young man in our society. This is based on what the research will show, but it's also based on my experience as a parent and grandparent. Really a very, very difficult time to be a little boy or a young man growing up in society. And there is a lot of inequality that exists in terms of education, in terms of health care, justice, parenting, and employment. And I'll try to touch on those as we go through this evening. Because of my personal background and because of the importance I place on this, I'll talk a lot about education because I think that's fundamental in terms of how it impacts on all the other things that we're involved in. But healthcare, justice, parenting, and employment, I'm happy to speak about it both from a research point of view, but also from a personal point of view. So the bad news, there's good news and bad news. The bad news is that the future for the current cohort of boys and young men is worse than we appear to realize. This is not maybe, this is a very serious issue, and again, the research will support that. And ultimately, it's going to negatively affect all of society. So when we fail to educate, important, when we fail to educate a segment of our society to the extent that they're capable of benefiting from it, we hurt all of our society. So when we fail to educate girls, all of society is damaged by it. When we fail to educate our Aboriginal community, all of our society suffers from that. And when we fail to educate our young men to the capability that they have, our society loses as well. So to give you just an example of how it negatively affects all of society, if one of my sons isn't educated to the maximum of his potential, he doesn't contribute to society to the extent he could. So he loses. His family will lose, his immediate family will lose, his extended family will lose. When my daughter marries a boy who is not educated to the fullness of his capacity, my daughter loses. That boy is losing, but my daughter loses as well. And their children lose. And my generation loses. Because we're all caught in this. We're all affected by it. So when we don't educate a segment of our population to their capability, we all lose. We lose whether we have to support these people by tax means. We lose by not having their productivity. We lose socially. We lose in terms of people's self-esteem. And in really crass terms, if one of my sons ends up living in my basement because he cannot get a job, he loses, and all the rest of us lose too. And if one of my daughters marries one of these young men that is going to spend the rest of his life living in his parents' basement, she's going to lose too, as are those children. I can go down this in some detail, but I think you get the picture. It doesn't just affect the people that are not achieving to their ability. It affects all of our society. everybody. So it's true in the case of girls, obviously. It's true in the case of boys as well. And if we correct the causes of the problems that exist, we're going to talk about a number of problems, but if we correct those causes today, it's still going to take 15 to 20 years before that works its way through society. Society doesn't turn on a dime. So if we have a systemic problem, for example, in our school system, in our legal system, in our healthcare system, and we begin to change that, it takes years before that plays out through the system. It takes years of people being caught in this and losing as a result of it. We can't correct the problem overnight, but the longer we wait to start correcting it, the longer the problem is going to exist. Now, if you have any doubt, I come from Ontario. If you have any doubt, then you just look at Ontario. We had a government in place in the 1990s that decided that our health care bills were too high. So they decided that the way to reduce the cost of health care was to reduce the number of doctors. So you'd have fewer people billing. So they cut the number of places in medical schools. 10 years later, 15 years later, we have a massive shortage of doctors. And someone says, this did not work. So now we'll increase the number of places in medical schools. Well, the doctors don't walk in the candidates don't walk in the front door and out the back as doctors. It's years before that's going to, and we haven't recovered from it yet. And that's incidentally not a comment on any particular government. That's simply a case that we need to recognize that all of these things take time to work through the system. So the sooner we begin to address them, the sooner we're going to recover from it. So that's the bad news. The good news, there are a lot of things that we can do. There are a lot of practical things that we can do. And these things don't disadvantage girls or young women in any way at all. The one thing that I'm not here to do, period, is to say we should advantage boys at someone else's cost. After all, it would be really unconscionable to deliberately advantage one group in society at the expense of a number. Wouldn't it? I mean, equality means equality for everybody. Doesn't it? So I'm going to talk a little bit about education. I'm going to do some of the historical context because it's vital to understand what's happening at the moment. See, for most of the people in the room, not everybody obviously, but for most of the people in the room, 1970 is ancient history, and I understand that. But prior to the 1970, in general, boys were outperforming girls in education at the secondary and post-secondary level. They weren't necessarily at the elementary level, but they certainly were at the secondary and post-secondary level, and most notably in the fields of mathematics and science. And that has been true as long as the records have been kept. And in the US, those records were kept starting in 1949. That has been true. So various groups proclaimed that we had a girls' crisis. I know this is ancient history, but it's important or you won't understand what we're dealing with now. So to deal with this girls' crisis, initiatives were undertaken. Now remember, without trying to give too much away here, I'm in my 51st year in education. I've been in teaching for 51, this is my 51st year. Unbelievable that I would stand here and say, I have 50 years in it at this point, but I do. A young guy like me. So in order to contend with this, a lot of initiatives were undertaken. And these included, among other things, but these included, we had gender selective hiring, including education, not a number of fields, but not because people like me were involved in it, but not because we wanted to say we need to help out girls who won't get these jobs. No, that wasn't the point. The point was the girls very often, when they entered secondary school, they went from a school system where about 30% of the staff were male, 70% were female. They went to secondary schools which were almost entirely staffed by males. they went into like a boys' club. So from the point of view of the young people involved, they were looking at, this is something men and boys do. And so if we were going to get young women into fields like mathematics and science, we needed mathematics and science teachers who were women. We needed little girls to see that's what women do. So we had gender selective hiring. If we wanted to get women to pursue a career as elementary or secondary school principals, we needed to have some women who were principals. And so we used gender selectivity to do it. So we had gender selective promotion to increase the number of women in positions of responsibility. Now, I'm not talking about this from a history book. I was there. I was one of the people doing it. And I had no problem doing it. It made perfect sense to me. If girls arrived and said math and science is for boys, because all the staff were male, we needed to have women in that position. If young teachers came into teaching and all principals were men, I would talk to women who clearly had the potential to be principals who would say, no, I don't want to do that. No, I'm not doing that. So we needed to say, okay, look, there are examples that you can look at. And we had gender selective promotion. Now, if you want to know how serious it was, we would send out an ad. I mean, I was the director of education. So we'd send out an ad, and we'd get 200 applicants, and we'd take the female applicants and put them in one pile, and we'd take the male applicants and put them in another pile, and we would only deal with female applicants. So the people who got hired were the best of the female applicants. The males never get looked at. It was true in hiring, and am I embarrassed or anything else? Not at all. Not at all. If you want to change the culture, you got to break the existing culture. So, fine. That's what we did. Well, I was on the examining board for the Ontario Ministry of Education, examining candidates to become supervisory officers. Because in Ontario you have to be certificated to do it. If the applicant is a woman, she passes automatically. This is in a day when we had a 15% pass rate. 85% of the candidates failed. If the candidate's a woman, she passes. Unless you have extenuating reasons to fail her, she passes. Candidate's a male. If you have good reason to pass him, fine. Otherwise, he fails. I can name names. I was there. I did it, and I'm not embarrassed about it. But what we did was we increased the pool of qualified candidates, qualified female candidates, so that when school boards hired supervisory officers, there were a large number of women to choose from. If we hadn't done that, the reality was we weren't getting large numbers of women. So that we did that. And we did it so that people had that role model to aspire to. You may be sitting here saying, who cares? Well, you're going to care in a minute. We have gender selective post-secondary school scholarships. Now, I stand to be corrected. And I'm quite willing to be corrected. I don't have a problem with that. But the reality is, there are a lot of scholarships given only to women who apply for medical programs. As far as I know, there aren't any given only to men. Now, why? Because most of the candidates in medical school were men. Now that most of them are women, those scholarships still exist. They were created for a good reason, and I don't object to it at all. Good reason. But we need to start looking at what does that tell us in terms of where we are now. So these initiatives have had the intended consequences. So there's been an increase in the number of women in all these positions. Great. in law, education, healthcare, and so on. Great, not a problem. Unfortunately, there have been unintended consequences. And I use that term unintended consequences because one of the jobs I've had, I was director with the Ontario government's Education Improvement Commission. And unintended consequences, that term came up regularly. You make decisions and you do things, and it has a consequence that you wanted. It may also have a number of unintended consequences that you didn't want. And there are a number of them in education. So let's see what happened in education. And this is important. It's important to the young people sitting in this room, young people compared to me, and it's important in terms of what it means for our whole society. So what are some of these? Well, one is there's a significant number of male teachers, including positions of responsibility. Now, if you want to know what that means, it means that 50 years ago, a third of elementary school teachers were males. The number of males in education, elementary education now is under 20%, and the number of males in teacher training for elementary school positions is under 5%. Little boys arrive in school. I can't speak for British Columbia, I'm sorry, and if I'm wrong here, I apologize for that, but I can certainly speak for Ontario. We have reams of schools, elementary schools, in which there are no men at all. And little boys arrive in that setting, and it doesn't take long for them to figure out this is a place for women teachers to teach little girls. They don't express it in those terms, they just know they don't belong. So we've got a real reduction in terms of boys' gender identification with education in general. So, schools for girls. Parents come and talk to me and they say their little boy who's in kindergarten is already saying that. So I'll have a mom come to me and say, what am I supposed to do now? My little boy doesn't want to go to school anymore. He says, school's for girls. There's been an unintended teacher gender bias in many areas. For example, these would include things like a general lack of acceptance of boys in school, a cloud of disapproval. Girls are good, boys are bad. And I guarantee you that if you go into staff rooms in North America, you go into staff rooms in the United Kingdom, I've been in all three, teachers will sit there and say, I got a good class this year. It's almost all girls. You're lucky. I got 20 boys in my class. School hasn't even started. I already know I don't like this class because it's mostly boys. One of my favorites. Academic grades are awarded to boys based on their behavior at school rather than their academic performance. This study specifically was done through Columbia University. Columbia University has been the premier education faculty of education in North America. They studied thousands of children and they looked at kindergarten-age children and they assessed them in math, science, and literacy. And then they asked the teachers, without showing them their testing, how they would grade the children in the class. And consistently, the teachers overestimated the girls and underestimated the boys. Except where the boys' behavior was similar to girls' behavior, in which case they were overestimated. Now, this is not a fly-by-night study. This is major one. Boys receive lower grades than girls for identical work. Queen's University did this study, secondary schools. Looked at secondary schools, gave out papers to teachers to mark. Same paper, girl's name on it, boy's name on it. Consistently, the boys got lower grades than the girls did. Same papers. This one has been replicated in the US as well. But it's done originally at Queen's. I don't know whether I have it on this slide or not. In the UK, they did the study with university students. And guess what? They got the same results. Consistently, they got the same results. This was done in the UK. So now we have a situation where one of the major predictors of how children will do, or in terms of their long-term performance in school, is their parents' expectation for how well they're going to do. Now that's not new. We've known this one for, at least 50 years. Parental expectation is one of the major factors. Well, you arrive at school as a parent, and if you're a parent, fine. If you're not a parent, well, I can tell you your parents arrived at school. And if the teacher's basically saying, John just doesn't have it, your expectation for John drops. And when your expectation for John drops, his performance drops. So you want to know how serious it is? This is major serious. This is major, major serious. This is a dad and a granddad speaking here. Normal behavior on the part of boys is now coming to be viewed as unacceptable, certainly in the school setting. I use as an example, and I just use this as an example. The research shows this, but went to a school where we were doing some research. I arrived at recess time, was walking across the schoolyard. So I'm walking forward, and I walk past a woman teacher, say hello to her, walk on, and I see a male teacher. It's on yard supervision. So the woman teacher's behind me, the male teacher's in front of me, and he's looking at me. Two little boys run by. I hear the female teacher yell at the boys. I turn around, and she now has them standing against the fence. So I didn't see any of this. I mean, it's all behind me. So I said to the male teacher, what did they do? And he said to me, I don't know, it all looked pretty normal to me. Well, you see, that's an example, but the research shows exactly that. So now we've got boys being suspended from school for behavior that in the past was previously acceptable. We've had a 100% increase in the suspension of boys. So stuff that boys did in the past that was considered perfectly normal is now unacceptable. We've got boys being, and I use the word misdiagnosed. I'm not saying ADHD doesn't exist. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that right now, 20% of the boys in U.S. schools, U.S. secondary schools, have been diagnosed with ADHD. 1 in 5. I mean, we're not talking epidemic here. We're talking pandemic. In the UK, the government is now intervening because they're calling this misdiagnosis and the amount of chemicals being used on these boys, they're calling it a chemical kosh. Now, if you're not familiar with the term kosh, it's like a club or a blackjack. Their boyish behavior is so unacceptable that they're not allowed in class unless they've been medicated. But see, we don't have any definitive tests for ADHD. You don't have a blood test or something that says you have ADHD. And what's happening, I know what's happening in the UK, is that the teacher basically says, this little boy is misbehaving, he must have ADHD, and the parents are called in and they're told your child will be excluded until he's medicated. So you go to your family physician, and I can't speak for the physicians here, but I know very well if I went to my family physician and said, my son has been kicked out of school because he has ADHD, the doctor wouldn't even bother seeing him. You just write the prescription. Because we don't have a definitive test. So how can we have 20% and we don't have a definitive test? We've got boys being increasingly being identified with learning disabilities that have very often been caused by the school system. Now, this is a topic for a whole discussion one evening. But I know this because I was one of the people involved in doing one of the big research studies on this. We went into a school system. We went from 11% children being identified with learning disabilities. I'm not talking about organic disabilities. So I'm not talking about autism or organic ones. But we had 11% system-wide. We made adjustments in what they were doing, and we went to 0. We went to 0. 2 years later, it took 5 years to play this through the system. 2 years after we stopped intervening, they were back to 11% again. Now, if that doesn't trouble you, we don't have any cures for learning disabilities. If you've been identified with a learning disability, you got it for life, kid. That's it. Because we don't have any cure for it. But we'll help you to learn to compensate for it. I'm not saying these are imaginary disabilities. They're real. But in a large number of cases, they were caused by the way the school system dealt with the child. Now, the evidence is there, and if you have, I'm not going to flog this, but if you have any doubts, they're in my book, and I have the actual numbers in there. So we've got boys increasingly marginalized in school, and that's in the book as well. And consequently, they're disinterested in schooling. Now, what does that mean? Well, we have had, in the last 10 years, we've had a 70% increase in the number of boys who say they will, when they're leaving high school, say they'll never set foot in a classroom again. Now, if you don't think that's a problem, that's like saying in some third world country, girls aren't allowed to go to school. If you have marginalized a group of your students, whether they're Aboriginals, whether they are people of color, whether they are whatever, if you've marginalized them to the point that they're never going to set foot in a classroom again, you've created a problem. And your whole society is going to deal with that. And this is occurring as our society moves to a knowledge-based economy, where post-secondary school education is more and more important. And we've got more and more boys saying they're never going to set foot into a classroom again. And if you don't think that's going to have societal issues, just think about it. Because see, we're looking at 10% of our boys, 10% of our young people, which means basically 20% of our boys, who are going to be dealing with systemic and long-term unemployment all their lives. And if you don't think that's going to have a problem, you wait till you have to carry the tax burden for those people who can't get jobs because it's a knowledge-based society and they're not in school anymore. So if you don't think that's an important one, if you're sitting here saying doesn't affect me, it will. See, Dave Cook, you may not know Dave Cook, but he's the former Minister of Education in Ontario. There's a quote from Dave. If kids don't get some kind of college or university education, they're probably doomed to a life of poverty. I worked with Dave when I worked with the Education Improvement Commission. So we've also got an unintended gender bias. And I'm saying unintended. I'm not saying this is some plot. People don't have to get these boys because they're boys. It's not intended. I don't believe it for a second. But now we have increased instances of depression in boys, sleep disorders in boys, and suicide. And suicide peaks for men. It peaks at 20 and 50 years of age. We're killing our children, and we're killing our fathers. Now, fortunately, I exceed both of those combined. But the reality is, suicide peaks. It reaches 80. It reaches significant numbers. 80% of suicides are male suicides at age 20 and age 50. And so we're killing our sons and we're killing our fathers. Governments won't admit there's a problem because who's crazy enough to step into that horrendous test? And the education system, well, if you think it's a big job to turn a massive ship around, it's got nothing compared to what it is to try to make any changes in a school system. And I've had every job in the school system, every one. You should see how hard it is to make anything change. So we've got parents and other people who are saying it doesn't matter anyway. They don't have any success dealing with the school system. So we hear statements, and I've listened to this one many times. Girls have always done better in school. Well, they have for the last 20 years, 25 years, they have. So in the lifetime of the person I'm speaking to, they always have. Problem is I go back past that. Hasn't always been like that. No. Well, I'm not aware of any problem. I don't have any sons, so it doesn't matter to me. So if you're sitting in here and saying, I don't have any sons, so what's it got to do with me? Why should I care? Well, we're all going to be hit by it, folks. All of us. Boys are not experiencing, this is one of my favorites. They're not experiencing any problem in our school district. We meet the needs of all students. Now, if you believe that, can I ever do a deal for you on a new bridge? We meet the needs of all students. We meet the needs of about 80% of students. About 20% we don't meet. Now you can say, so what? Well, let me tell you, I just flew in from Amsterdam yesterday. When I got to the airport, if they'd said, hey, no problem, fella, 80% of our flights make it, I wouldn't have been on the plane. If I went to buy a car and they said, hey, 80% of our cars, the wheels don't fall off, I wouldn't buy the car. 80% of these people we give these drugs to don't die from it. I go to the school system, we're doing great. 80% are doing fine. Yeah, well, what if I happen to be a parent of one of the other 20%? Sucks to be you, doesn't it? Or, why should I care? My son's doing all right. Yeah, well, you better care, because you know what? Your daughter may marry one of these bums. I mean, this is the reality of it. This is the really sad reality. Boys are just being crybabies. We've always known that. Or, what can I do? I'm just one parent. School board officials tell me I'm to blame, and my son is the only one in the whole system experiencing problems. I guarantee you, that's a very common expression, and I have met with well over 2,000 parents, grandparents, and so on, individually. This is not talking about group presentations. Individually, they have come to me to talk to me about their sons in school. And virtually every one of them says, I tried talking to the school board officials and they told me that my son is the only one having the problem. So it must be my fault. Yeah, like 2,000 times? So we've got to get on with changing some things. So it's time for a bit of a paradigm shift. But we need to change philosophy, and we need a lot of commitment on the part of leaders, and it's not going to happen quickly or easily. The education system resists any meaningful changes, so we got to look at the fact it's time for the system to put the interests of children first. Kids come the way they come, you know. If you're a parent, you know that. They don't come necessarily the way you want them to come. They come the way they come. All the people I deal with, everyone I see, comes the way they come. It's not for me to put a judgment on anybody. People come the way they come. So the education system to do a number of things. Have a genuine partnership with parents. Recognize that in Ontario, one of the big issues is I'm a co-parent. Yeah, you're a co-parent, are you? Well, the next time my kid spends the night there throwing up and I spend the whole night sitting holding his head over the toilet, you can come and do it. Because we're co-parents after all. Yeah, you're not co-parents. You're hired to work here. You're paid employees. You're not co-parents. Modify programs so children can begin where they are. If you want me to leap over that desk, I can't do it. But if you set it a bit lower, I could probably do that. And if I work on it, we work it up a bit at a time, I might get to that point. Big maybe, but I might. We have to take children where they are and the way they come. And we have to start with them there. And it's not the kids who are defective. And one of my favorites is every classroom, certainly at the elementary, even the secondary level, is the equivalent of a one-room schoolhouse. Children are all over the map. I'm old enough to remember one-room schoolhouses. If you don't remember them, they exist in many parts of this country. It's okay to be a boy. And it's okay to have a boy's interests and a boy's characteristics. It's okay. It really is okay. Boys and girls are different. Boys are not defective girls. They're not. I'm on a school council. This is not hypothetical. I'm on a school council. And everyone on the staff of the school everyone's a woman, which is fine. It's the way it is. So they have a school improvement plan. Now, in general, this is a big generality, but in general, boys don't learn exactly the way girls do. They don't approach problem solving the same way girls. I'm not saying it's for biological reasons. It's probably for socialization reasons, but the point is they don't. So what's the school improvement plan? Getting the boys to begin to learn as if they were girls. That's the school improvement plan. And I'm sitting there saying, shut up, Jim. Shut up, Jim. Shut up, Jim. That's your school improvement plan? Shut up, Jim. Okay, we need to place as much value on practical as on theoretical approach to learning. I'm talking about approaches. I'm not saying practical subjects. So, a child goes to biology class and he learns the parts of the flower. Some of you may remember that. Many of you might not, I don't know. But anyway, learn the parts of the flower. And how they interact and how it all works together. Little boy comes along and says, I'm really not terribly interested in the parts of the flower. But how about we take a look at this fuel injector? And we take the fuel injector apart and we see what the parts of the fuel injector are and how they interact. Same kind of thinking skills, same type of problem solving, and believe me, when you're on a deserted road in rural Ontario in your car stalls, it sure is a lot better to know about the fuel injector than it is about the parts of a flower. These are practical approaches to learning, not practical subjects. I'm not saying, oh, well, he's a boy, he can't do academics, so he can work with his hands. No way. Sorry, no way. That's so sexist, it's mind-boggling. But practical approaches to learning. So we can do that. We can operate schools where there's gender equity. For example, where male as well as female attributes, interests, and learning styles are valued. Now, it says male and female. It could say Aboriginal. I worked with the school system up in the Northwest Territories, and it was difficult to get people to put value on what the Aboriginals could do and what they were interested in. So they were being taught the Alberta curriculum. I said, what's this preparing them for? And they said, life in the South. Right. Oh dear. We need an equal number of male and female teachers. We needed it in the 1980s, and we did something about it. Now we need it in 2015, and nobody will touch it. No one wants to hear about it. Where teachers suddenly become aware of their own gender bias when they're evaluating student work. I'm not saying intended bias. I'm saying people have a bias. And it's usually unintended. But they need to be aware of that when they're evaluating student work, because it has long-term consequences, unintended consequences, but it has that for the young people we're dealing with. And I use the male because this is where my work began, but it applies in all areas. It applies to all types of differences that exist in our human endeavors here. So we need gender sensitivity training for teachers. And in this case, it happens to be women teachers in elementary school, because that's almost all there are. But we need to have gender sensitivity training for. We needed that 50 years ago. We need it now. It's just a different group that needs it. We need changes in the curriculum to better reflect the interests of boys. In Ontario, we've gone from a one-year teacher training program to a two-year teacher training program, which is 2 years of the same thing. So here's Dave Cook again. Why did we go to a two-year program? You didn't ask, but in case you did. We do a two-year program because we have a glut of teachers. So if you instead of having a one-year program, you have a two-year program, then you have a year in which there are no graduates. And previous year's graduates get hired. So you go to a two-year program. And why do you go to a two-year program? Because you're going to reduce the number of places in the faculties of education by 50%. So no professors get fired or laid off because it's a two-year program. Good thinking, huh? Now that makes sense educationally. That's going to make a big difference for our young people. Right. That's the education minister. We need to start looking at all of these things in terms of gender differences. We need to remind officials, government officials, that schools exist for benefit of all children. And I just say boys as well as girls, but I go down the list. Children with handicaps, children, and we just go down the list. For all of them. It doesn't exist just for the 80% or just for 10% or whatever. It exists for everybody. And one of my favorites, of course, schools don't exist to provide jobs. I mean, I worked as a superintendent, as a director, and we down the list. The schools didn't exist so that I could have a job. I existed so that schools would do a better job. Other way around, right? I'd go into the office, and if a computer broke down in the office, we'd have a repair person there within 2 hours. I'd go to a school, and 30% of the computers wouldn't be working, and they would be waiting to get someone to repair them. So, like the office matters, but the school doesn't? Have we lost something here, folks? We've lost the plot. And I'm saying gender is a valid qualification for a teaching job. If we need 50% men, then we're going to have to hire on the basis of saying, well, we're hiring men. It did in the 1980s, it did in the 1990s, and it does in 2015, whether people like it or not. So we need some initiatives to ensure gender equity. We need it for the sake of our sons, just as we did for our daughters in the past. We need to hire the teachers best suited to meet the needs of the students. I didn't say the best qualified. The people who are best suited to meet the needs of our kids. And one of the realities is, if we don't have visible minorities, if we don't have Aboriginal teachers, if we don't have the disabled, whatever we don't have, there's no one for those children to identify with. We don't have any of them. So we have to start looking at hiring the people who are best suited to meet the needs of our students. Not, back to my friend Dave again, not just the ones with most seniority. And that coming from Dave is really interesting because he's Mr. Unionized workers. So we have to recognize that all of these different things are treated as equally valuable. So that's my little bit on education. I'm concerned about healthcare funding. I know I'm shifting gears, but I'm going to go through these. I'm concerned. Just a few examples. In Ontario, I don't know if it's the case in BC or not, but in Ontario, if you want to get a PSA test, you have to pay for it yourself. Unless you already have prostate cancer, in which case it's paid for. We need healthcare funding in the area of prostate cancer research and treatment. The government spends 4 times as much on breast cancer research and treatment as it does on prostate cancer. And the prevalence of prostate cancer in men is higher and the death rate is higher than breast cancer is in women. One of my favorites is the HPV vaccination. We know that. The medical community doesn't argue that it's good for both boys and girls in terms of cancer. And so what did they say in Ontario? Well, it's expensive, so we can't give it to everybody, so we're just giving it to girls. Say what? Injustice, the justice area. I mean, anybody that isn't familiar with this, I mean, the sentencing of male versus female lawbreakers, same crime, so on. The assumption is we're going to hit heavily on the males and not on the females. I had an interesting case, again, when I was in the UK just recently. There was a case where a female and 2 males were involved in a crime, and the judge said that the female was the leader of the ring, and she got a life sentence, and the 2 males got 20-year sentences, I think. Which made sense, right? The leader gets... And she would be eligible parole in 12 years, and they wouldn't be until they had 16 years in. So, blew it out of the water. But if you only read the headline, it sounded good, until you read the script underneath. We got males and females in cases of domestic violence and so on. The whole issue of presumption of innocence or presumption of guilt. I can talk about males and females in the case of domestic violence. It's a reality with one of my own children, and I see the difference in terms of how people are treated. And if you haven't pursued that, I'm not going to waste a lot of time on it. But if you haven't, take a look, because you see, domestic violence is pretty much 50-50. And 60% of domestic violence cases are mutual. But we use what's called the Duluth model. So if I were to phone the police and say, my female partner is abusing me, the police would come and throw me out of the house. They wouldn't arrest me. They'd just tell me, one of you two has to leave the house. In every case, it will be the male who has to leave the house. Now, they don't say, you have to leave the house and here's a motel room for you. Get out. That's it. Now you're on your own. Well, where am I supposed to go? To the local women's shelter? Because they want me in. I'll go to one of the men's shelters. You do know about all those non-existent male centers? Find one. Tell me about it. We're shifting now from a presumption of innocence to presumption of guilt. Well, you know, maybe that's the way we have to go. I don't know. But I'm saying, when you make that kind of societal adjustment, that we're now operating on the basis of presumption of guilt rather than presumption of innocence, you've really changed things. You've really changed. Our society is really changing. That better be what we want. That's what's happening. Better be what we want. In terms of parenting, we got the whole issue of custody of children after family breakup. Well, if you're a dad, you'll be waiting a long time for custody of your children. If you don't pay child support, in my world, don't bother trying to get your driver's license renewed if you're behind in your child care payments. But if the court rules that you have access to your child 3 times a week and the mother doesn't let the child, you won't see that person's driver's license being withheld. We've got the whole issues around co-parenting. We've had 2 attempts at this in terms of cases that have gone to private members' bills that have gone forward, and they've been defeated both times because there is an enormous, there are a lot of lobby groups, but one of the big lobby groups are the lawyers. Because see, if you operate on the basis of co-parenting, the lawyers don't really have a battleground. But if you operate on the basis of saying we're going to take this to court, you can expect a dad to run up $200,000-$300,000 worth of bills, legal bills. And it's lawyers getting it. I wonder why they're against having that kind of legislation. Parental alienation. This is a sore topic with me, but it's because it's personal. I have a son that's in family breakup and all of these other issues. His children grew up, and for years they would not speak to him or see him. The well was being poisoned. Well, that's fine. Maybe it was true, maybe it wasn't. But you know what? My grandchildren don't want to see me because I apparently am a very bad person. Now, maybe I am a very bad person, but the children's grandmother isn't a very bad person. They don't want to see her either. They don't want to see her because they've been told how rotten and terrible their dad's family is. So they don't see their cousins, they don't see. Now, if you don't think they're losing, never mind the fact that I'm losing my grandchildren, those children are growing up, one whole segment of their life, one whole segment of their family is gone. It's gone. It's taken away from them. And it's taken away from them by a parent who, see, the key is love your children more than you hate your ex. Because if you lose sight of that, it turns into I hate my ex more than I love my children. Because it's your kids that lose. Okay, I missed one there. This is in terms of, I missed one, but anyway, I'll fake it. In terms of what happens to children who are products of alienation, and in this case it's boys and their dads, but we could do girls and their moms. It doesn't really matter. But they're, among other things, they're twice as likely to turn to crime as a result of unemployment. First of all, they're more likely to be unemployed in the first place, but they're twice as likely to turn to crime as a result of unemployment. This study was done by the Prince's Trust. That's Prince Charles in the UK. This is not a shabby, okay, we've got some group faking this. This is done by the Prince's Trust. They are more likely to state that they lack a sense of identity. They're likely to feel 3 times as likely to feel depressed all of the time, to be unhappy or lack confidence. The number they gave was significant. If they're unemployed, they're likely to suffer mental health problems. They're much more likely to commit suicide. That was in the first 3. They're much more likely to be involved in gangs and to look at gang leaders as role models. This is what's happening to our children. Who cares? Well, we better care, because this is our society. These are the people, as we move on in life, this is the next generation who's coming along. This is what's happening to them. Okay, employment and the wage gap. I think that one's really interesting because men are most likely to become unemployed. And if you look at the numbers from the last recession, you'll find that. Men are much more likely to become unemployed. So it's fine to talk about the wage gap, but we need to recognize the fact that if I'm in a high-paying job but also likely to be unemployed, there's a problem. We have greater segregation by employment type now than we've ever had. Just file that one away, because that one's interesting. We don't have a greater integration of men and women in different fields. We have a greater segregation. We are creating more and more, this is a field that women go into and this field men go into. Now, who would have believed that? But that's what's happening. If you are in the under 30s, you're going to find out that women earn more money than men do. So we have a wage gap. But in under 30s, the wage gap is the reverse of what everybody talks about. Didn't know that, huh? Bet you didn't know that. But that's the reality of it. And that under 30 bit is going to become under 35 and under 40. That's going to move up. So we're going to continue to have a wage gap, except it's going to be reversed. That's the 70% say they're never going to set foot in a school again. It's up there for a reason. University graduates earn 70%, on average, 70% more than high school graduates. And if you don't have post-secondary education, you're likely to face a lifetime of long-term unemployment. So the general wage gap's reversing itself, and it's continuing to do so. So there's a message for all of us in this. Just continue to do nothing. That's all you need to do, just continue to do nothing. No, go out there and do something about it. You came here tonight. Start. I think there's a lesson to be learned from the Gay Pride Parade, because this is a topic close to my heart. I work with the gay community in the UK. In the early days of the Gay Pride Parade, it took really a lot of courage to be involved. It really did. I mean, I don't know. Maybe not in your lifetime, I don't know. But certainly it took a lot of courage early on. Most politicians wouldn't be seen involved in it. So there's a lesson to be learned from that. Because after years of persistence and not giving up, the Great Pride Parade is now a commonplace event. And most politicians wouldn't dare not being seen front and center in it. So maybe it's time for male pride initiatives. How about a male pride parade? That one didn't resonate well. Okay. How about a male pride? No, okay. How about a Canadian Centre for Men and Families? Because see, there's one of them in the whole country. And you have no idea, trust me, you have no idea how much opposition we had to deal with to get that off the ground. You have no idea. This is not a male center for stocking weapons to go out and shoot people. This is a place where some poor fella can come and say, I really need some legal help, and I can't afford it. I really need to talk to somebody because I'm really feeling suicidal. This is what we're talking about. We're not talking about, that joke about the weapons comes from, I was in Medicine Hat, a friend of mine's there, and he took me past St. Patrick's Church, and he said, and this guy's my age, he says, yeah, when I was growing up, we all knew what was in the basement of that church. That's where the Catholics were storing their weapons for when they held a rebellion. Well, we're like in a center for men and families. It took a long time to get that off the ground, but I'm telling you, it's extraordinarily successful, and we now have hospitals where we're referring people to it. So there's no question it's needed. So maybe we need to look at that. I mean, equality means equality for everybody, doesn't it? Yes, it does. And if anybody's interested, just about everything that is up there is contained in my book, which costs me $20, and I sell for $20. It's not a money-making venture, obviously. I also have, for somebody who doesn't want to read 400 sources and 500 footnotes, because that's what's in there, I also have the whole thing distilled down into those three. Now, what it says in these three is, this book, as far as I know, never uses the term I think. Everything is predicated on the research shows. These say, if you want to read the research, read the book. But here are the meat and bones of the whole thing. If you want to read it, that's okay. So those are available as well. These I normally sell for the startling price of $2. But if anybody's interested, these are available as well. I have a set of children's books that I intend to donate, so hopefully someone will do it on my behalf, to the local library. These are books that I write for little boys. They are specifically based on the research around how little boys learn to read. And they're intended for preschool or early school boys. So I write these and publish these and sell them pretty much at cost, sometimes sell them for less than cost. But all of these books are in 9 countries, on 4 continents, in every Canadian province and territory, and in 7 or 8, I'm losing track, US states. So they are widely recognized, widely read. So that's what it's based on, and that, folks, is it. So thank you very much for attending. If you have questions, I'm quite willing to listen to them.
Thank you very much. We're going to take questions now, and I'll just facilitate just to make it easier. That's okay. Any question?
What's the situation in elementary schools as far as you know in terms of percentages of male and female teachers? And has there been any significant change over the last 20 or 30 years?
Yeah, it's gone from, it was about 1/3 male if you go back, 50 years ago, it's about 1/3 male. It's now down below 20%.
It's declined.
The number of males, oh yeah, it's gone down like a rocket. It's down below 20%. And if you look at the number of candidates that are studying to be elementary school teachers, it's 5%. The other interesting factor is that it used to be that 5 out of 6 men that went into teaching stayed. Now it's 1 out of 2. 1 out of 2 leaves within the first 5 years. So you've shrunk that down from 1/3 from 33 1/3%. You've shrunk that down to 20%, and in the future it's going to go fairly rapidly. It's going to go down beyond that, and even of the 5%, half of them don't last more than 5 years. And they don't last because it's for several reasons, but one of the big reasons that they don't last is that they arrive and they're the only man in the whole school. And they don't last because they are immediately perceived as pedophiles. So I put that out for what it's worth. I say that because I have taught every grade from junior kindergarten to graduate school and university and everything in between. And when I was an elementary school teacher, I used to walk across the schoolyard with one child holding that hand and one holding this hand, and it was like watching a flock of geese, because there'd be a child holding that one's hand, another one holding that one's hand, another one holding that one's hand, and I'd walk across the schoolyard in this big V shape. Now, there's not a chance that I'd be allowed to hold a child's hand. Not a chance. And when I think of that as a parent, it's tragic. Absolutely tragic. But that's, I'd be arrested. I'm molesting this child. Little kid wants to hold my hand. I go and I speak in schools and I do book readings with those books I showed you, and I do sing-alongs. So we sing, the chief character in this is a little boy named Jack and his cat, Gizmo. So there's a Gizmo song. There's a disc in here. There's a Gizmo song. And the children, they sing the Gizmo song and so on. I go into a school and I do this presentation for children, and when I leave, the children come flocking up and they want to hug me and so on, because they don't see many men. And I stand there rigidly, waiting for a teacher to rescue me. Absolutely, I'm just frozen with fright, because I think if I touch any of these kids, there'll be a parent calling the police. And I stand there, don't touch me. I don't say it, but I just stand there and think, oh God. Unbelievable. I was a school principal years ago, and I'd walk into a classroom and the kids would all come and they'd all hug me and so on. It was fine. It's not now. So men don't want to stay. If you're going to be perceived as a pedophile, and if there's no opportunity for promotion, and you arrive in a school and you're the only male, it isn't long before they leave. So the number is declining dramatically, which is what I was saying earlier, which is if you want to change that, you got to change it now in order to have an effect 10 years from now. And if you don't, like if I can't persuade boys that are starting university, or before they start university, that they want to consider teaching as a career, if I don't do that, if we can't convince them, well, it takes 5 years to graduate a teacher. So if we don't start at some point, we're not going to have any. And that's going to be a loss, because from a little boy's point of view, I'm now in a female environment. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah,
I probably killed it, but anyway.
I don't want to dominate it. Just
No.
want to ask one more thing.
Sure.
Do you think that's an indication of a fundamental gender bias in society as a whole? Or is that just an entrenched bias in the system, in the school system?
I don't think it's. The issues around children's safety and so on are that's part of the issue. The whole issue around children's safety. The University of Alberta did a study on. I know this sounds like I'm dealing with another question, but I am dealing with this. The University of Calgary did a study on children and the probability of them being injured walking to school versus riding in their parents' car. Well, they're far more likely to be injured with their parents driving them to school than they are walking to school. The University of Toronto did a follow-up on it. The report's just come out within the last month or so. That finds basically the same thing, that if you want your children to be safe going to school, let them walk. Don't drive them. But you see, when I was a young parent, I didn't drive my children to school. Now, if I didn't drive my children to school, all the parents in the neighborhood would be hassling me because I was a bad parent. I was letting my child open to be abducted, and well, the number of abductions is far lower now than it was 50 years ago. But when we get this idea in our minds that a male teacher must be a pedophile, we're in trouble. But that our society has taken that on that view. So yes, there's that. Now, is it some kind of plot? No, it's just that's kind of how things have morphed. Sorry, I'll go back to you. Otherwise, I'm going to be